Okay, so welcome everybody on this fine day to our latest OASIS lunchtime talk. A fitting topic to the winter time in Finland. We will today have a talk about exhaustion. The kind of exhaustion we experience in this neoliberal late capitalist society we live in. And maybe perhaps more specifically a talk that investigates the intersectional politics of play and exhaustion in the area. Playing games might alleviate the exhaustion we're talking about for some of us, but what if it sometimes makes things worse? Here to give the talk and to offer not only observations about the topic, but also suggest some counter tactics, perhaps. We have Dr. Rainforest Scully-Blaker, a postdoctoral research fellow here at the Center of Excellence in Game Culture Studies. Dr. Scully-Blaker's research is concerned with critical approaches to the study of games and players, and among many other things, he is interested in exploring how play can both uphold and dismantle hegemony. So, without further delay, take it away, Forrest.
All right. Thank you very much for the introduction. And, you know, I know he's not here today, but maybe online. When I first was talking to Oli at Nordic Digra last year, when we both knew I was going to be coming here, one of the things that he had mentioned was how, you know, for postdocs, if you've historically written in a group or with a lot of co-authors, then the center likes to try and give you the space to write some things on your own, and vice versa, right? If you've written a lot of solo authored pieces, then maybe it's time to try and find collaborators. And I'm definitely in that latter camp, between my work being pretty theory heavy and most of my doctoral research happening during peak COVID. I basically wrote most of my things alone. So, you know, you can consider this my elevator pitch for my research because I want to write with all of you. Although unlike a standard elevator pitch that's only a couple minutes long, we're in a broken down elevator and I'm just talking at you for an hour. You can decide if that's a good thing or not. Defer your judgment till I'm done. With that said, then, I'd like to welcome you to my talk, Games and Exhaustion. My core argument, just to get it out of the way, is that today's grind culture, which mostly grinds us to dust, is a problem which can be understood and perhaps addressed through a particular understanding of games and play, and I want to present that framework in the service of imagining and perhaps enacting ways of being in the world that are more sustainable in many senses of the term. So just to quickly break down this talk, I'll start with the context against which this work was written through describing what I call the exhausting status quo. Next, I'll move to the theory that underpins the work through key concepts I've coined like zugzwang and regenerative play, which I see as explaining how exhaustion persists and how we might yet combat it, and how all of this, of course, ties to games. And then from there, I'll move to three and a half areas in which I've approached this topic, which I will introduce as we get to them. To begin, though, I'd like to position myself in my work because, of course, my personal experiences up to this point are part of the backdrop against which this work was done. So, you know, nice to meet you. This is the house I was born in Montreal, Canada's trendy Plateau Montréal neighborhood. Although, like many of today's trendy neighborhoods, it was anything but in the 90s. I was raised there by working class parents who found the words to express their class consciousness through collective organizing with student and labor unions in the 70s. At the time that I was born, or shortly after, sensing it was maybe time to move their new child out of the old neighborhood, they sold their home with the intention to rent someplace for a year and then maybe buy something after that. And I don't know how familiar you are with Canadian housing issues or the Canada housing crisis, but it so happened to really ramp up that year. And so, you know, as soon as they moved out, they found themselves priced out of the market before they could ever really enter back into it. And so my political sensibility has grown in part out of this experience of renting wherever we lived for most of my life and experiencing the cycle of leases and repossessions, which continued through my adolescence and even into my adulthood, as of course even today, rents continue to go up without comparable growth in salaries or standards of living. This constant movement both figurative and literally from house to house. This inability to ever really feel at rest in one place is a big part of what led me to exhaustion as a framework and a vision of daily life that I call the exhausting status quo, and which I characterize in this way. The neoliberal capitalist logics that underpin our globalized world are failing. Wealth disparity is perpetually on the rise, while more and more people go without reliable access to housing. Some of the world's richest men semi-recently competed to see who could build the nicest rocket ship. Amidst innumerable economic concerns like these, minoritized and marginalized populations continue to fight for recognition and survival. So the Canadian Liberal government over there, led by Justin Trudeau, contested a court order to pay billions of dollars in restitution to Indigenous children who were willfully denied welfare. And meanwhile, in the United States, in the wake of the Black Lives Matter protests of 2020, efforts have since been made in many states to ban or restrict what is erroneously called critical race theory from schools, which includes historical facts like America's dealings in the transatlantic slave trade. These are, of course, only some very brief examples among very, very many, which also, by the way, reflect my frame of reference, the time and place that this research was done, even as I think they gesture to wider issues. To maybe get a bit more global then, let's not forget that the planet is also on fire and that it's all the more common to see headlines like people saying that climate change anxiety is affecting their daily lives, or more bluntly, that people think humanity is doomed. You know, cheery stuff. But in some ways, what might be more interesting to me even is the news that's supposed to be uplifting in these difficult times. So returning a bit more to my local context, when a restaurant in a Canadian resort town had no employees because no one could afford to live in the area on the proposed salary, and then a bunch of local retirees would go there to work for free to keep the place open, that was a piece of news that the Canadian news outlets thought was worth celebrating. Or when New York City is flooding because, again, the planet is suffering an ecological collapse, at least someone was able to order some food off of Grubhub, and then someone else was able to wade through the streets to bring them a meal, and the New York Post even hailed them a hero. So, key to my sense of the status quo then is this, that disparate though all these events may seem, unconnected though they may seem, they are all symptoms of the same socioeconomic trends, clear indicators of who and what is expendable to hegemony, which forms of labor are devalued or obscured, and the lengths to which many in a profit-driven market will go to adapt to threats of extinction rather than combating them, right? It's so clear to so many who are impacted by any of these stories or ones like them that something, quote unquote, must be done, but the list of those with the energy and the resources to put up any sort of resistance to what's happening is short. In sum, we want change, but we are tired. And just to be clear before we move on here, when I talk about exhaustion throughout this work, I'm not suggesting that things like racism, sexism, transphobia, colonial violence, or any other form of systemic oppression can or should just be collapsed into something that's bad because it's exhausting. Rather, exhaustion is my attempt to identify something specific that oppression of all sorts causes, and something which allows oppression to continue. And my hope is to outline ways that we might address it. So to do this work, I of course make several key theoretical claims, which I'll briefly summarize here. The first is that exhaustion is something which is systemic. It's caused and maintained by the very nature of how our society frames things like work and play. And here I'm inspired by the work of Sarah Sharma, particularly her work to show that experiences of something even as universal as time are based on our privileges, although class privilege is my, and I think hers to an extent, personal focus. I think you could get intersectional with this very easily. Next, when speaking of systemic change throughout my work, I'm speaking also of critical work, of critique, not just in the sense of saying, I don't like this, but rather the idea of building something new to voice dissatisfaction with the old. In this sense, of course, as much as I talk about slowness and rest later on, critique is non-trivial work that should be accessible to and accessed by all, and its difficulty is part of what I think makes rest important. Here, also inspired by the work of Kara Keeling, I think there is a use to imagining this sort of major systemic change as a when rather than an if question, which some may think is optimistic. But like Keeling, I think that the limits of our knowledge, right, the fact that we can't necessarily picture what that change will look like, is not a problem that we should focus on overcoming, but rather something which can help make that change feel possible. And finally, and this is, you know, keeping in mind my audience, you'll be happy to hear, this is where we begin to bring this work into game studies. I, alongside Mackenzie Wark, maintain that games are not in any way spaces that are apart from from real life meaningfully. Game is rather an operational logic, which I think can be used to describe all systems. And so I do work that sees the study of games here, objects, the video games or the board games that we play, as having bearing on the study of these larger games, these systems that we navigate as part of our daily lives. And throughout this work, I'm interested in how both can potentially be changed through play. Now, fittingly, where all of this kind of starts to come together, both the vision of the exhausting status quo and game studies and things like that is on the chessboard through the concept of Zugzwang, which I use as a model and a metaphor for how and why exhaustion persists and what we might do in response. So for those unfamiliar with the term, in chess, Zugzwang is any board state, like the one here, in which the obligation to move puts one at a disadvantage, right? In chess, we think so much about, this piece can move this way, this one can move that way. But one of the rules of chess that, is a bit more taken for granted is on your turn, you have to move. And so looking at the board here, if it's black's turn to move, any legal move they could make would worsen their overall position. And so, of course, when you're playing chess, maneuvering someone into Zugzwang is a deft path to victory. But in my work, it's also a model and a metaphor for the lot of many who live under the exhausting status quo. Critically, when using this term metaphorically to describe our larger games of individuals versus institutions, if you want, it's only ever the individuals who can be put into Zugzwang, right? So if you compare the consequences faced by the United States for having a $31 trillion national debt to those faced by one person who can't afford to pay a $100 utility bill one month, such a comparison reveals that there really is no comparison and that the game, so to speak, is not balanced. So individuals need to constantly make moves, and those moves only seem to allow them to make do with the scant energy, time, and resources that we've been afforded. But I ask in my work, if we can use a game like chess to draw parallels to the systems of everyday life in this way, then how might this framework also help us to seek ways of refusing such moves and instead finding more restful alternatives? So to work against this conceptual problem of Zugzwang that I put forth, I did some reading and some thinking, as one does, and eventually was able to articulate a couple of concepts to lead us towards maybe a way forward, one of which is radical slowness. So this I somewhat shamelessly adapt from the concept of radical softness, which comes from queer poet and artist Laura Mathis. It's this idea that sharing your emotions in a society which prioritizes alienation and self-management, as ours does, that prioritizes taking care of yourself, is a political act, right? To speak out and say, like, I'm unhappy is, instead of just taking care of it yourself, is a political act. And so from that, I derive the term radical slowness, which I define as a deliberate failure to move at the pace expected by the norms of capitalist productivity. And again, like radical softness, I think it's a deliberately political act. Recalling what I said earlier, though, about our experiences of time being determined by, among other things, class privilege, I don't want to suggest here just by saying slowness is radical, that we should all take a nice vacation. As we'll talk about a little bit later, slowness itself is not inherently some sort of emancipatory force that'll just fix all our problems. In particular here, I take that lesson from the history of the slow food movement, which of course began as this very political protest against fast food, among other things, and is now, not to, gloss over it, but is now effectively a lifestyle brand for those who can afford the time to cook and afford to source their ingredients locally and all that jazz. The other concept that I think is helpful here is regenerative play, right? So this work is not about buying into slowness wholesale, but rather surveying how slowness functions in different spaces and different contexts and picking one's moments to be slow carefully. So regenerative play then is a term that I coin when arguing that maybe if we try to, trifle with those games that exhaust us, we can find a more regenerative way forward. And that, of course, again, this will take a lot of work, even if it involves moving slowly. Regenerative, I do the cute academic thing of putting the parentheses there to signify both that I mean regenerative play brings rest, it regenerates us, but it is also helping us build something new. It's generative. Of note throughout this work, again, last bit on theory, is that I use rest in the way that it's been politicized by others like Tricia Hersey, for whom it is a demand and a refusal, a reclaiming of stolen time and energy to render ourselves more human in a way that I also think helpfully recalls Paulo Freire's work in the pedagogy of the oppressed, right? This idea that we are striving to become human subjects with our own agency and interests instead of a resource that can be tapped into by these larger systems and then be literally and figuratively exhausted. And so, you know, acting on all this scaffolding is the project in a nutshell. I look at games, the object and service of drawing parallels to game, the system, and through all that, I'm always thinking of this idea of exhaustion and how slowness and rest might serve us in combating it. So for this next phase of the talk, I'll move into some examples of how I do this. The first will be set in game culture, broadly speaking, and I'll be talking about some Foucauldian discourse analysis that I did to analyze how things like slowness, play, and leisure are talked about in different online spaces. To this, I'll also add some complementary work I did through game analysis, re-evaluating some key game studies concepts. I haven't really talked about that part of this work anywhere else, so lucky you. Then, given my interest in tackling systemic games through the study of game objects, I'll dig a bit deeper into some examples of how games are designed and how they are played in ways which might engage with or even confront some of these ideas. From a design standpoint, today I'll offer brief analyses of 2 games which I see as potentially combating exhaustion through the way they were made. And then for play, I'll do close readings of a couple of play practices I've observed in the wild and make arguments both about what this play is doing within its particular video game system, and then perhaps think about how we can lift those tactics out of the video game and think about using them in service of imagining and enacting slowness in other spaces. So, buckle up. Beginning with the discourse analysis then, right? So I had all this theory, which I've now walked you through, but I wanted to look at how people, of course, were actually discussing slowness and exhaustion in game culture. Here referring both to players and even to games in some ways. And so I sought out community and conversation wherever I could, and here's what I ultimately found. And again, as I mentioned earlier, this is kind of where, despite any hope that I might have, I found that slowness, play, and games are not themselves inherently emancipatory forces for good, but nor are they inherently oppressive. Rather, as we'll see, this part of the talk talks a lot about how, by virtue of existing under neoliberal capitalism, any of these leisurely pursuits are kind of always already shaped into something which exhausts us. And we'll talk about how that works. So, starting with community, right? Slower play practices and like all these engagement with pedagogy, the oppressed and things is not exactly something that spawns any obvious community in popular game culture. But as I was looking for communities of gamers that thought about paces of play, I did find this group, this subreddit called Our Patient Gamers. You can read the full description there, but essentially they're a community that waits at least a few months after a game first comes out to actually play it. The history is that it started with Skyrim and some people being bummed that they could not afford to buy it at retail price when it first came out in 2011. But over the years, other legitimate grievances about, the day one patch, waiting for DLC, things like that, waiting for the game to get good, have led to more and more people kind of joining the bandwagon of becoming patient gamers. And, when I first saw this, I thought, oh, great, jackpot. This is a remarkably anti-consumerist stance that this group of people have, which identifies some key issues with the industry and reacts to them in kind. Most of the threads, as I started to read them, consisted of players, recommending games to each other, as one does, especially reflecting back on games that they enjoyed in their youth. But then, as I started pouring through these and looking for other types of discourses or discussions, I noticed something interesting. So for all the positivity and all the recommendations and celebration of games, there were things like this. So I don't know how easy it's to read back there, but you see titles like people who work full-time, how do you find the time to play games that you want, bonus points if you have kids, gamers above 30, do you find your ability to game for longer periods of time has lessened as you've aged, or kind of the apex post, I'm becoming an impatient gamer, where the person says, quote, what have I become, right? So for all that positivity, there are things like this. And through reading all of these in tandem with everything else on the subreddit, it became clearer that the fond memories that players were sharing with each other, right, these nostalgic reveries of games gone by, were not actually for any specific game or even genre of game itself, but rather for the fact that their play was enabled by taking place in a time before they had realized, their responsibilities, or before they had, found any uncertainties in the world, both the normal ones that come from growing up and the unintended ones that come from economic and environmental upheaval. Friendly reminder. So, through this, I argue they speak of longing for a return to a time before all of these things. But in keeping with my framework, what I ultimately argue they long for most is a return to a time before they realize their capitalist subjectivity, right? This idea of, having infinite time to play and playing always feeling good and not something you have to worry about. And one way that this was reflected rather poignantly was in some of the other threads on this subreddit that I read, which discussed the gaming backlog. So fun English fact about the word backlog that I learned while doing this research is that the term, unsurprisingly maybe, but you don't think about these things, I guess, used to literally, or originally referred to a literal log at the back of a fireplace. A big log that would be kind of held in reserve and would keep the fire going even after all the other pieces of wood had gone out, right? And what you might notice, and this happens in English a lot, and it's kind of fun when it does, is that this is the exact opposite of how we use the term backlog now, right? So I'm sure I speak for many of us as students, scholars, and people who work adjacent to computing technologies when I say that my sense of backlog has always been the opposite sense, this accumulation of stuff that I have to do, this to-do pile, right? And of course, this sense of the term is not just limited to grading or papers or emails, to anything work-related. It's also used by many to talk about their play, right? The gaming backlog, Steam sales, buying too many games and not having time to play them, that kind of stuff. And they talked about it on patient gaming too, where they're deliberately waiting to play games and they still felt like they had backlogs. And so players here feel saddled with games to play in a way that I think complicates the received definition that play is always a voluntary, free, fun activity. One gets the sense here rather that I think play is transactional, that we invest money for free time. But as I saw, when patient gamers spend their money and then do not have the time to enjoy their leisurely investment in quite the same way that they used to, they feel a disconnect there, and there's frustration, there's guilt, and there's even, exhaustion. And without fail, whenever someone would post something about the backlog, lamenting how they had too many games to play, someone else would chime in and say something like, maybe you just haven't found the right game, Maybe what you need to be comfortable is to just play something else a bit more relaxing. And they'd often recommend so-called wholesome games, which, great games that emphasize warmth, kindness, and community instead of violence and competition. However, and this is a brief digression, part of why I think this recommendation of wholesome games specifically is important is because of the ways that wholesomeness is kind of being deployed right now in contemporary popular culture, in that it kind of rides the line between something like radical softness, right? Again, sharing emotions as a political act on the one hand, and a more conservative appeal to the kind of good old days on the other, which for me is well understood through the example of square dancing in the United States. Despite seeming rather benign, this traditional dance is taught in gym classes across the country and is the official state dance of the majority of American states. Again, things you learn. And all of this is because noted car mogul and white supremacist Henry Ford lobbied for it and against what he perceived as the moral degeneracy of jazz music. So this wholesome tradition, like so many before it, has its roots again in like this bigotry, this white supremacy. And that's not to say that like all wholesome games, therefore like, are white supremacist plants, but you have to think about these terms and kind of the histories that they have, right? And so between the patient gamers asking, what have I become? And this sense that oppression can wear many masks, I'm sure these people are fine, they're having fun. I'm compelled to ask what role comfy coziness has in keeping things the way they are. And, so recapping this cycle of impatient consumption that I observed, in want of leisure, right? Players seek out games as one does, but they have less time to play as they've gotten older. And so a backlog begins to form and they feel guilt, they feel exhaustion, and that sparks a seeking out of more games. And sometimes those can be wholesome, cozy games. And here that introduced to me this idea of comfort as something that is kind of an enemy of rest, which may seem counterintuitive, because with comfort, I try to capture both what these players covet and what things like wholesomeness promise, namely a removal from the anxieties of the present, something that allows you to feel better just like right now. But critically, of course, this is a false exit from any of the issues that we face on the regular, which in fact actually keeps us exhausted by keeping the existing values in place, even if we can step away from them for a little bit. So here, of course, I'm indebted to the work of Svetlana Boym, who says that nostalgia, like that expressed by patient gamers, represents fantasies of the past which occupy our present and threaten our future. And so in that sense, unlike my hopes for rest, I use comfort as kind of a contrasting term, which I see as conservative. Because again, if one were truly comfortable with how things were, then why would they ever seek to change them for themselves or for others? Okay. So as I said, this is a little something that I added in for the first time, exhausting games and concepts. Not to say that the concepts are necessarily exhausting, although maybe they are, depending on your point of view. But this is part of the project that I think is relevant to this audience, doing game analysis as a way of revisiting some game design concepts. The part itself is quite long, and I will, just gloss over a lot of the key points, but hopefully there's a couple things that are neat for folks here. The context for this is that, again, as much as games are framed as, in popular discourse, these unproductive wastes of time, I suggest that there has to be some reason that they're thriving so distinctly in our present moment. And one reason, or one thing I look to, is that perhaps they are precisely the opposite of unproductive, right? That they are productive of the exhausting status quo. And these are some ways that I try to point to that by, again, asking, what are games productive of? So the first thing that I look at, the first concept, is workification/gamification, although we'll focus on workification today, right? This idea of the games we play becoming more like work, which is a seemingly recent phenomenon. But the way that I talk about that is through a comparison of Desert Bus and the Truck Simulator series. Now, for those who have somehow been unfortunate enough to not have heard of Desert Bus before, it is a game that was never officially released from a while back, where you take the role of a bus driver who is driving from Tucson, Arizona to Las Vegas, Nevada, which, if you're not as familiar with American geography, I mean, I don't know this off the top of my head either, takes 8 hours, and in the game it takes 8 hours in real time. This is about the only screenshot that you need to see what you see when you play the game. A bug might spot on your windshield, or you might see a cactus or a tumbleweed, but this is it. You're just driving on a straight road for 8 hours straight. The only thing to keep you from just taping down the accelerator button and walking away is that your bus is kind of broken and will always steer a little bit to the right. So you have to be there constantly steering left. And if you ever fall asleep at the wheel and you go too far off the road, your bus will break down, and then a tow truck has to come and tow you back to the start again in real time. Great game. If somehow you actually persevere and you make it all the way to Las Vegas, then you are awarded 1 point, and a dialog box pops up asking if you would like to do some overtime and drive back to Tucson for the chance of a 2nd point. Or you can also quit the game, which I imagine most people probably do. And so obviously, when this game came out, or didn't come out, I guess, but when it was devised, it was done so by Penn and Teller, who are a pair of magician comedians from the States. And it was a joke, right? Like, it is a parody about verisimilitude, the desire for seamless simulation taken to its furthest extent. And yet, what does it mean, kind of in hindsight, that now there's this series of truck simulator games where, yes, there's a lot of quality of life improvements. The distances are not real life distances, but in some sense, the gameplay is almost the same, right? You drive somewhere, you pick something up, you drive somewhere else, you drop it off. And unlike Desert Bus, people love this game. Like, I did research into the community of people who play this, and they build battle stations to make it more immersive, more feeling like they're in the cab of their truck. Some of them even aspire to and actually become truck drivers in real life at some point. And so again, kind of looking at this way that, like, has game design changed over the years? Has it not? Has our attitude to it changed or not? Aaron Rauch in 2016, talking about workification, says that games have begun to feel more like work. But through this kind of brief history of games where you drive from one place to another and it's kind of boring, I ask if that's really anything all that new, or if rather it's that game or play and work are just kind of concepts that collapse into each other, and that are harder to distinguish than we might have thought. For the next one, I revisit the concept of control by talking about Coffee Talk and Papers, Please, which I frame as games that are both about the service industry in so many words. You know, you're dealing with people on a daily basis, and even if one of them is you're a barista in a fantasy cafe having a nice time, and the other is you're a border guard in a fictitious authoritarian country, both kind of service jobs. In these games, what interests me is that the challenge in both consists of bending to the game's shifting rules and expectations like a good post-Fordist laborer would, right? Which reflects, I think, usefully how Gilles Deleuze talks about control as a social force. So for him, we have moved out of, Michel Foucault talking all about discipline and institutions and how, we go from school to the workplace and it's all just these controlling things to keep us on one path. For Deleuze, he says that we've moved beyond that and into a new model where it doesn't matter where we are, it's that wherever we are, the standards that we are pursuing keep shifting and changing over time. And even if we ever feel like we've attained success, then inevitably the goalposts keep moving. He says it never feels like you finish anything. And, I don't know about soulless corporate job working in a cubicle and go work on the farm to enjoy gameplay, which, of course you can play in a lot of different ways, but if you're playing the game well, and, meeting all your goals, it can be just about as rote, as flow-based as any logistics position in an office like that would be. So I use this to think about flow theory and this moment where you shut out other things and just focus on a task. And again, I've played Stardew Valley for hours at a time and not noticed the time go by. So I don't think it's a coincidence. One thing that I see less of when we talk about flow in the literature, though, is that part of the discussion from Csikszentmihalyi is that he says people will do this at great cost to themselves, which for me kind of recasts flow as a design ideal in a bit of a negative light. Like, why do we want people to do something at great cost to themselves? There are reasons, but none of them good. So this shutting out of other things, again, thinking back to wholesomeness, I think can be tied to a desire for escape, for a desire for comfort, which maps well to existing critiques of flow, because of course people have talked about how being in this flow state is, a way to control people and things like that. And recalling what we just said about the collapse between work and play, Csikszentmihalyi also describes jobs as flow-like, since they have built-in goals, feedback, rules, and challenges, all of which encourage one to become involved in one's work and to lose oneself in it. And so, kind of wrapping up here, I also try and tease apart this definition through the famous flow chart a little bit by asking whether, there's this ideal flow state in the middle, but perhaps boredom and anxiety, which are on the other ends, are forms of flow in their own regard, which has bearing on Zugzwang because, if flow is to be understood as a deep engagement in a particular task, then surely the task of maintaining one's existence must entail a flow state of some description. And, is someone more skilled at living if they have class privilege to be bored? Is someone less skilled at living if their lack of class privilege induces anxiety? Kind of trying to poke holes in this as many people have before. But yes. And so wrapping up this section, I've set out to identify what games are productive of in various ways, and I know I had to speed through it a bit, but the answer I found, spoilers, is that it's the enshrining of dominant values, and here at least my focus is on exhaustion, of course. So between the patient gamers and their backlogs, or these examples of a productivity game in an Amazon warehouse, a gaming PC set up in the cab of a truck driver's truck, perhaps to play Truck Simulator, I don't know, or even looking at the institutionalization of esports and the platform of Twitch and things like that, it becomes clear that just by virtue of existing under the system that they exist, our leisure time and these pieces of our leisure time become framed in ways which perpetuate exhaustion and lead us to trying to seek out easier, more conservative comforts instead of something more lasting like rest and change. And again, this isn't me blaming people and saying like, oh, you're all lazy. It's a very real thing that affects all of us, myself included. And so this is the part of the research TLDR that's kind of saying this is why change is so hard, right? If my, research corpus were an epic poem, this would be the part where we were all the way at the bottom of hell, as low as we can get. But that means it's now the time to pick ourselves up, dust ourselves off, and try moving back upwards. And while maybe the ultimate ideal of paradise is found somewhere in the realm of changing systemic games, remember that, of course, to get there, we have to look at games as the object first in order to draw parallels and maybe find some ways forward. And so, as I've said, when talking about the game as object, there are a couple ways we can do that. I'll do design first and then play. Beginning with design and designing against exhaustion. Now, one key thing to consider when talking about design in general is that many of the ways that we frame it in our work and in our writing, especially in game studies and design studies, are very positivist. That is to say that we often speak of the designer as someone who can guarantee that a game will have a certain meaning that the players will then just kind of receive as if from on high, right? And it's not a question of whether a given design choice might help achieve a certain effect. It's always written in terms of, here's how you do X with Y. So here's how you teach empathy with games. How do I make my player do this or that? And this is not a universal claim in design literature necessarily, but it is a pretty pervasive one. I think procedural rhetoric and things like it cast quite a long shadow over the discipline. And I'm sure many of you who have taught or taken design classes have experienced questions from your students or peers like, how do I make my players behave a certain way here? Or how do I make them feel a certain way? Now, there are obviously reasons why writing about design in this way is practical, especially when we're learning. And we can, of course, nuance it a little bit in how we teach the subject. But in my project, where we're talking about these larger questions of systemic change, right? This gets really tricky if we think about trying to design a game that makes players think critically, since that assumes that critical thought isn't already happening during play, and also that telling someone exactly what to think is somehow critical. Thinking again of Paulo Freire and the pedagogy of the oppressed here, it all feels a bit anti-dialogical, right? You're telling someone what they need to know rather than inviting them into a dialogue with you to try and figure out what, benefits everyone. And something that I've begun to think about, and I'm sure other people have before me, I just need to do the reading, is about how we can make design more dialogical. But I digress, right? So this is my little canned critique of design and how we write about it. But even then, obviously the practice of designing games and being a designer is still important and impactful work, as I want to suggest now through a couple of examples. Beginning with Kind Words, which, for those who haven't played it, it's a game about writing and receiving short, anonymous notes with other players. So aesthetically, it's a pretty cozy game about seeking and giving advice. You can either write a note anonymously saying, hey, I have this issue and I'd like your thoughts, or you can pick up other people's notes and offer them anonymous support or advice or what have you. And so again, we might argue that this is an attempt to design towards an ideal like radical softness, but I think that the way it actually plays out in the game is that it actually serves to make people just kind of comfortable with how things are, rather than trying to do anything bigger, like building solidarity or helping us work our way out of these things that are causing us these stresses to begin with. So for example, in interviews, the development team, Pop Cannibal, mentioned the election of Donald Trump as something that was a source of huge stress, or dare I say exhaustion, for a lot of people, and that's what led them to make this game. But when you actually play the game, the way that the game works is you're much more just kind of focusing on individually helping individuals with individual problems. And there's not like a commiserate on the rise of fascism button or anything like that, which obviously would be a tall order, and there's reasons for why that is, but I still looked at this as an interesting example of both trying to design a community of care through a game, but also how difficult that is and how those can be flawed. The other game I want to talk about is Tracy Fullerton's Walden, a game in which you play out noted philosopher Henry David Thoreau's famous one-year experiment of living off the land on Walden Pond and then writing about it. So what I really like about this game is not necessarily Thoreau's philosophy, although for those that have read it, you might see some linkages between his ideas and kind of a slower way of living, and I think that's fair. But rather, what I like here is the way that the game contains things which contradict its own underlying themes and ideals. So, as I mentioned earlier, part of why so many self-proclaimed critical games fall flat for me is that they're so didactic that it can't really feel that critical at all. Like when you're playing it, this game is just trying to tell me something. So in this game, you're playing as a real person, right? A real intellectual who famously lived off the land. But as you play the game, you start to realize these true biographic details that get left to the sideline, like the fact that the pond is just a mile down the road from your best friend's house and you can go visit him whenever you want. Or if you walk a bit further down the road, you can go into town and there your mom will stitch your clothes back together to help you stay warm through the winter. Or you can even just legit steal a pie off her windowsill. And at no point does the game respond by having like a window come up that says, oh, that's bad Thoreau behavior, you know, you're playing this game wrong. These are all just options for you in the game space that you can do or not do. Part of what helps me think about this game a lot is also that Fullerton has written about this game a lot and about leaving it open for exploration and how even slowness and reflection are important tools in a designer's toolkit. But when you actually play the game, it isn't about any of these things in any super over-the-top didactic way. So I look to it as fruitful ground for exploring how contradictions can be found or explored in other systems as well. And then finally, while design theory can oversell what games reliably do in the world, producing works which try to undermine dominant logics and values still is obviously super important. Design may be an imprecise tool, but the work of designing has value, especially if we can devise some best practices for something like a restful design, some of which I summarize here from what I've said already. They're not perfect, but they get the conversation started, I think. So avoiding didacticism, the language of designing towards a set of goals rather than designing for them unflinchingly, helps here. At the same time, I think it's important that you try to name the oppression that compels you to design if you do so. So again, if kind words was a bit more on the nose about, hey, these are the things that are stressing us out, I think that would be helpful. And again, I think you can do this without being didactic, but it's of course delicate. And then allowing your games like Walden to contain their own contradictions. And finally, on that note, I think that even if design has its limitations, there are of course many other ways that game designers, as laborers, have adopted a socially just praxis. So we can think of ongoing unionization efforts, as well as other cooperative or non-hierarchical labor models that are beginning to grow in popularity in the industry. All right, with that said, we're ready to move on to the third and final slice of things with these close readings of play practices. And so recalling what I said way at the beginning about play and about critique, about critique, not play. Play is something which is very special to me because unlike even design, which requires certain skills or the time and space to be creative, play is ostensibly something that we all do at some point during our day, right? It is a form of critique, therefore, that is accessible to all people. And today I want to touch on two instances in which I see play subverting the internal logics of a video game in ways that I think can be generative of thinking about how we might bring slowness and resistance into larger systems. So the first story is set in World of Warcraft and concerns the player character Double Agent. So unlike some of the other games I've talked about, I think this one needs a bit less of an introduction. But of course, in the Great War between the Alliance and the Horde, which I think has since ended, but at the time it was raging, I assure you, there was the Mists of Pandaria expansion, which famously let you start off as a neutral party on your own little island between the two warring continents. And the idea was that after completing some quests and reaching about level 10 or so, your character is prompted to leave and choose a side and join the war, right? Now, Double Agent flipped this idea on its head by making a character at the time when the war was still raging and playing as a pacifist. So, like a lot of MMOs, you get experience from killing monsters, doing quests, but you also get small amounts of experience from picking herbs and from mining minerals. And so Double Agent did this not just to level 10, but all the way to the in-game maximum level cap. And by the way, every time it was raised after that, he'd go back in and do it to that level cap. So we're talking hundreds and hundreds of hours of just picking herbs. And because his character's never done any quests, the game doesn't really know what to do with him. He's never been prompted to pick a side, and so even though he's hit the maximum level cap, which in some metric is, you know, the pinnacle of success in this game, right? I mean, there's a lot of them, but this is one. He's still stuck on this initial tutorial island, forever a neutral party. And so kind of stepping back and looking at this, we can say that this type of play subverts the underlying logics of World of Warcraft, dispensing with its goals and values for a separate, super non-trivial, again, hundreds of hours to do this, goal that the player themselves picked. Interestingly, though, as much as I might celebrate it within the video game's rules, We might also say that double agents play does not subvert the logics of everyday life, since I think in a more play culture standpoint, this can be tied to a lot of gamer bro narratives of mastering the game, and of course, which bodies and which privileges afford one the time and space to play World of Warcraft for hundreds of hours to achieve this feat, right? Even so, I think that what's valuable for me from this, what I lift out of it, is the way that the player gets cast as a glitch within the game. So when I say that here, I'm using glitch in the sense that Rosa Menkman and others have used it, which is defined as a rupture in a process, which then in turn reveals the underlying logics, values, and assumptions of that process. So double agent, by playing in the way that he plays, kind of stops the normal operations of the game and reveals, by being stuck on this tutorial island and not being able to, do a lot of the things the game expects you to be able to do, reveals a bit about what the devs were thinking when they made the game and what values were kind of left on. It builds these beautiful but strange landscapes that you see here. And true to their name, they are very far away from where you first spawn into the world. You have to move to a coordinate that's quite big in order to cause this glitch to occur. And players initially discovered them just by using cheats to teleport vast distances, but since that discovery, two people have undertaken the absurdly long task of walking there all the way on foot. Now, similar to Double Agent and how much time his play took, for context, the distance to the far lands from where you spawn into the average Minecraft world is about 11,500 kilometers, which is a bit more than the distance from here to Jakarta, all on foot. And so they're doing that. This image of walking to the end of the supposedly infinite Minecraft world proved really striking for me when I first found it, and so I did a bit more research about the hard limits of the game space. And if one were to somehow continue walking, because this doesn't actually completely destroy the game, you can forge on. If someone were to continue walking approximately 2 million kilometers, say, or the distance between here and deep space, the game itself cannot actually sustain a greater distance, and instead ceases to function. The algorithm that keeps the game running is overwhelmed, and the game has no recourse but to shut itself down entirely. Now, obviously, this is practically impossible because 2 million kilometers is pretty far to walk. But the fact remains that if someone were to persist in walking in this way in a straight line for a long enough period of time, they could still succeed in walking out of the game itself just by playing in this way. And so beyond subverting the game by refusing its goals and threatening to bring it to an unceremonious end, I see this play and the consequences of taking it to its fullest extent in The Crash as a case for the critical emancipatory potential of a slower play practice like this. Indeed, if removing ourselves from an oppressive, exhausting system can feel impossible, why not think about ways to remove the system itself? And of course, while it can be exceedingly difficult to imagine us crashing the largest systemic games in the same way that it might be more feasible to crash Minecraft, I think that it's worth noting at the end of this talk that we're in the midst of a lot of interesting developments that are pushing the bounds of what might be familiar, types of play that might chip away at these larger systemic games. And so, if the beginning of my talk depressed you, then, consider this the chaser to the shot. So among young adults in China, the Tongping, or literally lying flat movement, has manifested as an expression of frustration with the pressures of working oneself to death. Meanwhile, in the West, people continue to leave their jobs in droves as part of what's been called the Great Resignation. For those that stay in their jobs, we're also seeing many efforts towards unionization in a lot of sectors, including the video game industry, with cases like Raven Software, ZeniMax Workers United, or Sega of America. And of course, many of these cases of unionization are met with backlash from companies and union busting tactics, so it shows that this work is ongoing. Right? These are, of course, encouraging developments, but of course, more work always remains to be done. And if we ever become comfortable with these small consolations, then exhaustion, I think, and fear will just seep back in, as well as the broader logics which keep the working class and other marginalized people in Zugzwang. So, as I said at the beginning of this talk, right, the neoliberal capitalist logics that underpin our globalized world are failing, but perhaps one of the most nefarious aspects of this deterioration is how we are made to feel as if there is no alternative, right? And through my research, both past and future, I hope to bring us a little closer to imagining and enacting other ways of being in the world and trying to find rest in something like a radically slow praxis. Thank you. Laptop was really heavy.
Well, thank you so much for the very insightful talk. I'm really glad to have listened to it. Awesome, awesome. I'm sure there are some questions in the audience. We have 7 minutes left of our time, so I can't myself come up with a question so fast. But there, up.
There are no stupid questions, Tom.
Okay, sorry about this, but something you said really early on in your talk fascinated me.
Huh.
You were born in a house.
Yeah.
Cool. Was that political, or was it like the ambulance didn't arrive in time kind of
I see what
situation?
you're saying. I see what you're saying. No, I wasn't literally born in the house. I gestated in the house, and then I was born at the hospital. But then I went back to the house right after and grew up there for a while.
Yeah, no, okay, I get all that, but you see my confusion there because it's like
Yeah.
often it's like a political decision that's made
Yes.
to have your child in a house.
Yeah. I mean, just like naming your child Rainforest, so it would map. But no, I misspoke. I apologize.
Yes, so in Finland everybody is born in a sauna. So
Oh, there you go.
Thank you so much, Forrest. But I hear a different voice whispering through all your presentation from Karl Marx.
Oh,
And he is using circus instead of comfort, like he's using alienation instead of exhaustion. And then when thinking about design, I'm then thinking about, okay, the means of production, so this, no, I forgot your, regenerative design, should then be the gamers' needs, like the means of gaming, right? So I'm like, have you read Marx at all? I mean, this is very, it could be commented by him.
yeah, I mean, certainly the secret conclusion to my talk is that we need to dismantle capitalism, and that it's kind of the source of all of these social ills. I have read some Marx, maybe not as much lately as I would have liked, but I've read a lot of Marxists, and so maybe a key one for me is I guess not like, maybe not as much a Marxist, but like this thinking about like labor and leisure and the idea that like, again, right, in the contemporary moment, the reason why play is tolerated is because it makes us ready to do more work. And there's a philosopher, Giorgio Agamben, who talks about how supposedly back in the days of yore, before capitalism, we played in ways that were totally independent of that. And he says that now we dance, but we don't hear that music. We're just playing as a way to give ourselves the time and space to be ready to do more work the next day, which I found really hard to get out of my head, definitely. But yeah, no, there is Marx and Marxist stuff in here for sure.
Thank you first for this talk. When you mentioned Reddit, I started thinking about the one thing. As being a part of Monster Hunter series community, I heard a lot of complaints of older players and some of new, like younger players, on the last parts on Monster Hunter Rise is in particular, which is felt like it was designed for players who don't have much time, who have kids, and who still want to play it and have 10 minutes for a hunt instead of 50. But still, the game received this huge amount of complaints by players that it's less time and energy consuming. Did you encounter something like that would be like this dissatisfaction with the less exhaustion from the game?
I think that's really interesting. I think Monster Hunter is a great example, and it's one that I'm less familiar with. No, that's super interesting. I think definitely it ties to sort of dominant gamer culture discussions around, these are as old as time, right? The price of a game should reflect how many hours it takes to beat it. This idea that you're investing money for time playing a game. I haven't encountered anyone saying like, man, I wish this game wasn't so slow. but I guess part of that is the, I guess, echo chamber of trying to find community in these spaces of people who like playing games like this. But yeah, I mean, I think that's very interesting, and I'm sure, like, in the same way, you know, I mean, part of the other thing about like the wholesome games line is that as much as, you know, I'm like, whoa, we need to like back off on this a little bit and realize that there's some uncomfortableness to the term wholesome. There's also a lot of really important things happening in those spaces, and this is where some of the most interesting and kind of anti-establishment games are being made, is in these spaces. So hearing players be unhappy about a game being, you know, less for a core gamer is not that surprising, but I do think that's a really cool example, honestly. So I don't know, maybe I should look into that more. Thank you.
I have two questions. What's the relationship between backlog and capitalism? The sort of the idea that we need to play more and more and more, and all of these games need to be finished. Sort of, do we need more games or less? Is basically my first part, and the other thing is sort of this sort of nostalgia that you talked about for childhood, when we had time to play in a relaxed manner that we've then lost. Sort of how. Political tone of sort of it's longing for a time without responsibility. So just sort of wondering if you have thoughts about that.
Absolutely, thank you. So I think definitely that the backlog, I mean, the ties between the backlog and capitalism, I think, come from this kind of cycle of consumption, right? Where you are compelled to buy a bunch of games because you think one of them is bound to hit, one of them is bound to give me this thing to do with my leisure time. And then inevitably, especially when things go on sale on Steam, we can talk about the abstraction of money through credit card purchases. We can talk about a lot of things. You end up with just this bigger and bigger pile. And then it really, like, viscerally for some of these players, they're really feeling it, especially, I guess it's maybe even because it's this community that is so conscious of playtime. But even at one point in the project, I talk about it briefly, Steam had a spring cleaning event, which, distinct from a sale, was actually go back into your backlog and play games, and we'll give you little like on-platform bonuses and emojis and things like that if you clear out your backlog, which of course for them you can read as both like, oh, they're acknowledging this and they want to help people not be so anxious, but also they want people to play all these games so they can go buy more games. I think for me, kind of the idea of like games that, you know, are shorter and people get paid more to work less, like this kind of meme is part of the ideal for me. And I think also the question of like, do we need as many games coming out as we have coming out is, I think, a pretty hot button one in the industry right now. And just the sheer amount of hours that are going into making these things that are supposed to be fun, but are done on the backs of people that are having anything but. And then the political, like the I guess like the politics of the nostalgia. I mean, again, kind of, I think, even if it does, it's kind of like anything to do with like comfort or exit or things like that. Like, even if they don't explicitly have a politic attached to them of like, I miss my like white suburban, like, you know, Clinton or Reagan era, like free space to be an individual. It's like, as long as you are removing yourself from, you know, like to be neutral in the face of oppression is to take the side of the oppressor, essentially, right? So that like, whether or not these people, I guess it's kind of in line with the same stuff of like, oh, I don't want games to be political, I want to be apolitical, I want to be neutral, this game doesn't have politics, don't worry. It's like that kind of like centrist slash supporting the establishment, tacit kind of stuff is what I would think when I read that nostalgia. And that's why I say it's kind of, in the same way that wholesomeness is a conservative affect or comfort is a conservative affect, I think nostalgia and comfort are really tied together here. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. That's all the time we have for today, and I'm sure the discussion will continue when we go for lunch somewhere. But again, once again, applause for Forest's talk.